It is a wonderful honor to welcome Sally Reed onto this podcast. She is a poet and the editor of a new volume titled 100 Great Catholic Poems, and we are going to focus our discussion on this particular volume. Sally, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thanks ever so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and to be discussing such a lovely book.
That's wonderful. And we are recording this at the end of November, so the beginning of the Catholic Christmas season. So, how are you looking forward to it?
Yes, I'm looking forward to, I always look forward to Christmas actually. And actually the book sold out really quickly, so people are wanting to get it for a Christmas present, but it's not that easy to get hold of at the moment. But you can pre-order it for just after Christmas.
I see. Well, that's wonderful. So, what is the special appeal to Catholics about Christmas?
Well, because it's the birth of Jesus Christ, so it's incredibly important to us. I think in the early church, Easter, which was the death and resurrection of Christ, that was the major feast. But as time has gone on, then Christmas has become very important to us as well. And it's very important because it marks the incarnation. So it's when God became man, it's when God took on flesh. So it's of enormous importance. And Advent, which begins on Sunday, is a bit like Lent for us in the sense that it's a period of preparation and vigil leading up to Christmas itself.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So, right. Tell me about your journey as a Catholic.
Well, I've only been a Catholic for 13 years. I was originally an atheist, and I lived in London and I was working as a psychiatric nurse, and I've got a sort of atheist family, and I was very much brought up as an atheist. And then I became a poet. And to me, poetry has always been a way of sort of making sense of the world, and a way of whenever I was dealing with kind of suffering or heartbreak or looking at the world in its kind of unpleasantness, then I would always run to poetry as a reader and progressively as a writer as well, to give it shape and to give it meaning, which I realize now was quite a sort of religious outlook in a sense, but I didn't, it's almost like my religion at the time. Um, but I didn't convert at that time. Um, I eventually married an Italian man and went to live near Rome. And I was becoming very disillusioned with poetry because I felt that contemporary poetry was very um, clod bound. Contemporary poets, especially perhaps in England, are very conditioned not to look to the transcendent and not to look to things beyond the everyday and to beyond the purely subjective. So I was feeling very frustrated, and I began a book about female sexuality. And in the course of researching that book, I was in touch with a Catholic priest, and we began talking about the Catholic Church, which I really didn't like the Catholic Church at all because um, for many reasons. I mean, I found it, patriarchal and constricting, and I thought the rules were ridiculous. I found it intolerant. But we got talking, and then in that year, which was 2010, um, that spring, I had kind of three major kind of experiences of God, which converted me. Absolutely. It was the strangest thing because I wasn't kind of looking to be converted, and it wasn't like I was piecing things together. Really, I suppose unconsciously I was kind of ready for it, but God kind of seemed to present Himself to me, and I believed, and I had a very kind of visceral experience of Christ coming to me while I was sitting in a church one day, and it was like um, it was like I had amnesia, and it felt like somebody walked into the room that could give everything back to me, like everything could tell me about myself and my life and my place in the world. And it was just the most amazing experience of love. So that was when I became a Christian. And then over the next few months, I was reading and putting things together, and then I became Catholic. So from atheist in the March to Catholic in the December, it was a very, very quick journey. And since then, I've been continuing to write poetry and have written some books about my spiritual journey as well. And I'm really glad to have done this anthology for Word on Fire because it uncovers the Catholic tradition of poetry, which is incredibly important in a literary context that's, that's wide. I mean, it's a very important book.
Mhm. So, like you, I'm also a Catholic convert from, I'll say, secularism. I entertained the idea of atheism for some time, but I find it to be lacking in answers. So I wonder if during the transition phase from atheism to deism or Christian deism, um, what was it that made you, I guess, doubt the premises of atheism?
Well, there are many different kinds of conversions, and I think some conversions are very intellectual and sort of philosophical, and mine really wasn't. Mine was all about mine was all about overwhelming sort of experiences. And so I could see no intellectual way of arguing for God. I can now. Like if you said to me now, okay, let's talk about, the proofs of God, I could refer to Thomas Aquinas and I could refer to philosophy, and I could do that. Perhaps not very well, but I could do that. But back then I wasn't thinking like that. I just couldn't see how there possibly could be a God. It just sounded like a fairy tale. But I suppose that the most rational, if you like, sort of as in using my reason, experience that I had was, I had these three experiences in that spring. And the first one, I was rereading a book called I Capture the Castle, which is written by Dodie Smith, which is a really lovely coming of age book. And in the book, the protagonist is an atheist, and she's talking to the vicar about art. And the vicar says to her, um, religion is an art. It's the art that it does what all the other arts attempt. It's about communion with God. And when I read those lines, even though I'd read them many times before, there was something that just absolutely struck at my soul. I just understood that what I was trying to do as a poet, which was to find connections between things and find form and find meaning, that's what God had done. God had created the world and created me, and I was trying to communicate with him. It suddenly made absolute sense that I wasn't trying to communicate with the literary London people, and I wasn't trying to communicate with the readers of poetry magazines necessarily. I was trying to communicate with God. And that's really hard to explain, but it really kind of hit me with tremendous force. And so, it was a very visceral experience, actually more than intellectual. And now I'm aware of the intellectual arguments for God, and of course they're perfectly reasonable as well. But I feel, I feel like I know he's there because I've met him. Like it's that at that level. I don't really need to argue it, and I don't need to worry about it. Um I see what he does in my life, and I see what he does in different places, and and that's it for me.
It's wonderful. Yeah, and congratulations on your
Oh, you
conversion.
too.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you plan to attend midnight mass?
I generally go in the morning because I'm very much a morning person. I know some parts of the world the midnight mass is a real big thing. Actually, in where I'm at the moment, I'm actually in Suffolk. I'm not in Rome, and in Suffolk, the midnight mass is actually about 10 o'clock in the evening.
Mhm.
So it's not quite the same. So I think I'll go on the Christmas morning.
Yeah, I'll probably attend midnight mass. It would be my first, since I'm only a recent convert. I've
Oh,
been in the faith for like just a year.
oh my goodness! Congratulations. So is this your first Christmas?
Um, yeah, I say so.
Wow, my goodness me. So, and which country are you in at the moment?
Currently, Hungary, Budapest.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, there's a big Catholic, it's a massive Catholic culture there.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I see. There's also a great Vietnamese Catholic culture there,
Mhm.
and I'm originally from Vietnam, so that's pretty good.
Mm. Oh wow.
Yeah. I had a chance to talk to Holly Ordway, who
Mhm.
is part of Word on Fire. She wrote a spiritual biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, and
Yeah.
it was a wonderful conversation. So I wonder if since you are in England right now, has the Catholic Church in England changed since the time of Tolkien?
Well, I guess it must have done. Right. I mean, I haven't been around to see it, but I think that in England, the faith Christianity has been in decline generally. Now, how Catholic parishes have fared in relation to Anglican parishes, I don't have the figures. I'm guessing that the Catholic parishes have done a bit better than Anglican parishes, but I don't have the figures, as I said, so I can't really say. Um, the Catholic Church is strong. I see the church is strong in England, and that's to some degree because of immigration. We have lots of Polish people in our pews, and my own parish, we've got lots and lots of families from India, and so I think that immigration does great things for the Catholic Church. But there are also pockets of renewal all over the place. I mean, I do some work with St. Patrick's Church in Soho in London, and they do amazing things there in terms of evangelization and feeding homeless people and providing all sorts of things. So I see it as not doing too badly at all. But I guess what happened too was that I believe there was a big intellectual movement with Catholicism in England in the 20th century that was led by the likes of G.K. Chesterton and Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene. And I think, those lights have dimmed a little bit. And I know that when the Latin Mass was done away with in the 1960s, there was a massive response from artists and writers in England, and not just Catholics, but just artists and writers generally, who were saying, you can't do this, you can't change something that's so beautiful. And I think it did change something. I'm not saying that necessarily that has to be a bad thing, but there has been change. But
Mhm.
we're always in a state of flux, right? It's always about renewal. So we always have to pray that good comes out of things, and we can have there's a new Catholic literary revival going on right now with amazing poets who are writing
Mhm.
in the English language, who are immersed in the Catholic faith.
So I haven't had a chance to attend an actual Latin Mass. So tell us about the significance of that tradition to Catholics.
Well, I should tell you too that it's not something that I attend myself. It's
Oh,
because I really, for very practical reasons, I live in a small town near Rome, and the nearest Latin Mass is sort of into Rome and a bit of a journey. So, while when my daughter was young, it just didn't make sense to take her all that way. It made sense to take her to the local parish church. So often these things come down to kind of logistics. But I'd love to attend it actually. I think it's there has to be something really special about mass in the language that it's been in for such a very, very, very long time. Um, but I'm by no means a kind of TLM attender, and I don't tend to beat the drum for it particularly for that reason. But I think it's good to have diversity in that way, and it's lovely to have that on offer.
yeah. So going back a few questions ago, you said that when you were a non-believer, you viewed the church yeah, with the adjectives of patriarchal and restrictive and such. Has your views on the church changed since?
Yes, it has. Yeah, I mean, obviously, any institution that has men and women in it is going to be flawed, and I can see that there are things that are flawed. But when it comes to the structure of the church, I have no trouble at all. And I think that the patriarchal bit, what this boils down to is that what happened to me in 2010 was that I really fell in love with Jesus Christ. Okay, now Jesus Christ is a man. He's a man and he's God. And I'm not keen on the idea that Jesus Christ would be a woman, or something in between. He is a man. That's what God chose to send to us. So I think that once you accept that, then it becomes much easier to see that actually sexuality does matter and gender does matter. And that I'm perfectly happy to go along with that. I find I have difficulty really with people who say, oh well, more women should be priests, or there should be more women doing this or more women doing that. Of course, it's great that women are involved with all these things, and yes, more women on the theological commission, that's all good, etc. But let's not get tied up with kind of thinking that we can have more power or we should have more limelight, because the priesthood isn't about that anyway, or shouldn't be about those things. It shouldn't be about power or limelight. And I think women in my own parish, women have an awful lot of sort of, I won't say power because I don't like that word, but women are very, very involved. And when you go to a weekday mass, who's in the congregation? It's like 99% women, if not 100% women, all the time. If the priest was a woman as well, there'd be no men involved at all. I think it would be really sad. So anyway, this is a convoluted answer, but I don't worry about the patriarchal side of it. I don't feel it robs me of my power. I'm very devoted to the Virgin Mary. I think she has the kind of power that I would want to have, and I find her to be an exemplar for everybody.
Now, my perspective is that I think the worst thing that the church can do is, well, these days at least, I know that it has been involved in terrible misdeeds in the past, but the worst thing that it can do today is to get too much involved into day-to-day politics. So that's why I don't necessarily have any opinions regarding, a female priesthood or the matter of, homosexuals in the church and all that. I think that the church, rather than getting involved in it and pick a side, should offer an alternative to political discourse, which, as you and I both know, is getting increasingly calcified.
Absolutely, it really is. And I agree with you, and I try and stay out of all that stuff as well because I just don't think it's very useful. We have eternal truths given to us, and I think we just have to put our heads down and pray for personal sanctity, and that's all we can say to other people. Like, it's not up to me to say to somebody, you need to think this or you should do that. It's about introducing people to God, and then they're on their own journey with God, you know. So yeah, I think politics is not helpful.
I have a personal perspective in regards to, I guess, the decline of Christian following and Christian belief in the European continent, in that I attend, when I attend churches where predominantly Europeans, and in this case, Hungarians attend, I find that they are never filled. But when I go to the church with my people, the Vietnamese, they are often filled to the brim, and oftentimes we would run out of seats, and some people would stand. So, how do you explain this decline in faith among Europeans and an increase in faith among, I guess, non-Europeans?
Well, I guess maybe an easy answer is that in societies where people are very comfortable, they look to God less. And I think that that's probably the easiest answer. I mean, when 9/11 happened, somebody said that, you know, they were giving out rosaries on the street, and everybody was accepting a rosary and everybody was praying. You didn't get anybody saying they were an atheist on that day. And often that's what happens, is that when we're under attack or when we're poor, we turn to God more easily, and we need God. And that's why comfort and having um, so much comfort and so many options and all the rest of it, that's when people forget about God and they think that they can make it on their own. I think that's probably the answer.
Mhm. So, in the question of poetry, so how did you become a poet?
Well, I've always loved poetry, and when I was a psychiatric nurse, as I say, I turned to it very much in the reading of it, and I also started to write it, and I was very determined to try and become a published poet. Like, I really, really wanted to do that. So I worked very, very hard at kind of taking my initial poems and really studying what was being written and studying past poets, and really worked hard at getting published in magazines. And then I had my first book published when I was 33, I think. Um, and that had come after sort of lots of magazine publication. So that's really how that worked. But I think I've always written poetry, and in a sense, I write less poetry now because I'm writing so much prose. So I have published a book as a Catholic poet. That was 2 years ago. But the last couple of years, I've been busy writing a book about the Virgin Mary. So that's been taking up my time. But I think that my prose is very poetic. I think if you read my prose, you'd say, oh, this is obviously a poet. So I don't really draw lines so much.
Mhm. So, what does poetry, well, in general, and your poetry in particular, seek to communicate?
Well, I think poetry is all about trying to express things that are very, very difficult to express, and trying to give voice to things that are silent, or give voice to things that are kind of spaces between things where we don't tend to go and we don't tend to talk about things. it's naming things that are not normally named. So it's about taking something which is kind of difficult or incomprehensible and forming it and letting people see it in a different light so that they can access it through images that they are through images that can surprise them, but at the same time they are familiar with. So, you might say, something looks like something else, so it's about drawing people in through what's familiar, but at the same time giving them some what's called defamiliarization, where they're kind of surprised by things.
Mm-hmm.
So poetry is challenging, but actually it's also supposed to help people enter into difficult mysteries and to make those mysteries more accessible.
That's it. Yeah. So how would you compare, I guess, your pre-Catholic poetry with your now Catholic poetry?
Well, there's two ways to answer that. The first way is that they're incredibly different, because my first book of poems was very forthright and quite shocking. It was a lot about relationships and about sex and all the rest of it. So people found it very shocking, even people who weren't religious. So the first thing to say is that if you looked at the first poem in that book and compared it with my later poems, you'd say, this is so different. But actually, there's a kind of physicality that runs through all of my poetry. And in my first couple of books, there are many poems that reference religion and reference the Virgin Mary, which I think is interesting, and that they're by no means orthodox poems. They've got a lot wrong with them, but I was obviously searching for stuff. So I think the tension between the physical and the transcendent has always been there in my poetry, and I don't think that's really changed. But if people look at my last book of poems, then they'll find lots of poems about the life of Christ and about the saints and about Mary, but always done in a very kind of physical, hopefully relatable way to kind of enter into the experience.
So does the figure of Jesus Christ feature in any way during your non-theistic life?
In the poetry, no, I don't think I ever wrote about Jesus, but I did write a lot about Mary,
So
which is interesting.
tell me about the Virgin Mary as a poetic subject.
Well, it's funny because when I wrote the poems actually for this book, I'll show you, this is my Catholic poetry book. It's called Dawn of This Hunger.
Mm-hmm.
And the poems go from the conception of Our Lady all the way through to post-resurrection. And when I was writing them, I realized at a certain point that I was writing poems about in the voice of St. Anne, and a poem to St. Joseph, and lots of poems to Mary, a poem in the voice of Mary Magdalene, several actually in voice of Mary Magdalene. And then I realized that I wasn't writing ever in the voice of Christ. And it was almost like I had to stay out of that. It was almost like I couldn't get too close to him. So I've even got a poem in the voice of the crucifier, the person who banged the nails into Christ on the cross. Okay, so it's almost like I have to write around him and I cannot write in his voice. And that's very personal to me. I just feel that trying to give voice to Jesus Christ to me it's almost impossible, and there's almost something inadvisable about doing that. So I think that Mary is great because she's the person closest to Christ, and perhaps for me she's easier for me to empathize with and to kind of speak to poetically, because she's one, she is entirely and solely human, whereas Christ is also God. So there's a kind of a big difference, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I find that Catholicism is possibly the only Christian faith that that glorifies and exalts Mary. So again, I ask you from your perspective, what is the significance of Mary to the Catholics?
I think, absolutely huge. And I think that it's sad because sometimes that's lost. Certainly, obviously in Protestantism, that can get very lost. And even in Catholicism these days, a lot of Marian devotion can be considered, well, we don't want to go there, and that's very old fashioned. But, actually, it's not simply a question of Mary in the New Testament. If you study Mariology, you can see that it goes all the way back to the beginning of the Old Testament, and that Mary's presence is there right from Genesis all the way through. She is the woman who's going to step on the snake, and she is the woman mentioned in Revelation. She's the one that prays for conversion. She is the new Eve, and in medieval times when medieval people were praying their hours through the day, they would often use parts of the wisdom literature, and they identified Mary as wisdom, and also Mary as the holy city. So she is also the Ark of the Covenant. So she is many things, not simply one sort of skin and bones woman. And so she's got enormous spiritual significance. As I say, of course, Jesus Christ is the be all and end all. But Mary's the person that we have she's not divine. She's simply one of us. But she's had the most incredible access and closeness to God himself. So she's a fantastic intercessor for us and a fantastic model. And she is our mother. Christ gave us her as our mother. So she's tremendously important.
Yeah, in the Rosary prayer, you say, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and the hour of our death." So, yeah, tell me more about the role of Mary as the intercessor to us.
Well, so I mean, as Catholics, we believe, that, and it's like, I think, Protestants believe that you can ask your friend, you can say to a friend, "Oh, pray for me." Okay, so to Catholics, that's just it would be logical, therefore, that we'll be able to sort of ask saints to pray for us, people who are in heaven, and they're sort of close to God. Please pray for me. So with Mary, it's just taking that, it's the same logic. Ask Mary to pray for us, and of course, that's even more powerful because Mary is the closest person to God. She's the closest person to Jesus, and she's the mother of the Son, she's the daughter of the Father, and she's the spouse of the Holy Spirit. So she's right there with them. So it would make absolute sense to ask her to pray for us. And why would we need to do that? It's one of those mysteries. It doesn't mean that you're not close to Christ. I mean, I always pray to Christ, absolutely. But it's funny how sometimes I think God wants us to turn to Mary, because I think he wants us to remember her soul humanity and her humility. And he wants us to realize that he gave all this power to this small woman. She was what, 13 or 14 at the Annunciation. It's the most incredible thing that he did, was to choose this very, very small person to do that. So I think that, and that's why the devil hates Mary. So I think that there's so much power in following Mary, and she will always bring us closer to Jesus, because while we may think that we love Jesus beyond anything else, Mary loves him more. And if we can follow her, she will show us how to love him, and how to love him like a mother, and like a sister, which is what he himself asked us to do. In the Bible, he said, "You'll be my mother and my sister and my brother." So, yeah.
I think about that great sculpture by Michelangelo, La Pietà, where Mary holds the crucified Christ in her arms. And what is so striking to me is that Mary doesn't look aged at all, so to speak. She looks roughly the same age as when she bore the Son of God. So tell me, why do you think this is the case? Why do you think Michelangelo made so?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting sculpture, because not only does she look, well, I've kind of read different things about that. Yeah, she does look young. You're right. She looks young for perhaps what she would have been. But I guess if she had him when she was about 14, then she would have been, you do the math. She would have been, she probably looks, I guess, a bit young for the age that she would have been. And more than that, even though she's actually bigger physically than Christ.
Mhm.
Because if he'd have done it realistically with her physicality, then she wouldn't have been able to hold Christ lying across her lap like that. So she is kind of bigger physically than her son in that sculpture, which is interesting as well. So she kind of she does have she has great significance and importance in that sculpture. And it's as if she's kind of holding not just the form of a man, but a huge truth and a huge event. So I think it's quite a philosophical sculpture. It's very, very beautiful.
So here's perhaps a poetic question. Can we have Christ without the crucifixion?
No. should I have hesitated? I don't know. Well, no, I think that the whole thing with Christ is that he is all of those things. There is his birth, his death, and his resurrection, and you can't take one away. That's his miracle. That's what he was sent to do, by the Father, and so therefore it's very, very important. Yeah, wouldn't have worked. Wouldn't have worked. It's the power, isn't it, of his death, and like how incredibly awful it was. The agony and the unpleasantness of the crucifixion is only reflected in the enormity of love that it represents.
Yes, I was thinking about that novel by Kazantzakis, the Greek novelist, and also the Scorsese adaptation, The Last Temptation of Christ, where Christ had a vision where he escapes the crucifixion, but then in turn, the war is doomed.
I think, artists will always imagine those things, and there's something similar. There's a novel by Colm Tóibín called The Testament of Mary, which equally imagines that Mary runs away from the cross and that she wasn't on board for the whole thing. I think artists have to have that freedom, and I think Christianity is really good at saying that. We have to remember that there are other religions that don't give people such freedoms, right? So it's very important that people are allowed to think those things. But at the same time, we must remember that the truths of the faith are very clear. And if you start to believe that Christ, ran away or, wanted to run away, then it's a dangerous place to go. I mean, I think what's beautiful is that, we have the Garden of Gethsemane in the Bible, and we know that Christ found that incredibly difficult and said, take this cup from me if it's your will, but your will, not mine, be done. So we have that insight into his humanity. We know that it was horrendously difficult. We know that. So, but God takes us on trust, and trusts us with the knowledge of his humanity as well as his divinity.
So I imagine that when the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she's going to bear the Son of God, I wonder if we're not sure to what extent is she religiously devout, but I know that in the book of prophets like Isaiah, it is foretold that the Messiah will be persecuted by man. So her son shall suffer the same fate. I wonder if she thinks about the fact that 33 or so years later, she would have to bear to see her son suffering on the cross.
Yeah, this is really interesting in terms of how much Mary knew, and there are different thoughts about this, particularly through the Protestant denominations. I mean, I'm not a theologian, so I'm going to just say that before I say anything else, but I think we can confidently say that Mary was extremely devout, and tradition has it that, she was presented to the temple as a child, etc. So, and Benedict the 16th wrote beautiful things about the Annunciation, and he quoted some ancient literature which said the Annunciation was an act of hearing, and it was Mary listening so closely to God that it was really through the ear that, in a sense, she could conceive the Son of God. So we know she was devout, and I think that devotion of hers would mean that she would have been aware of, obviously, the prophecies. She'd have been aware of Isaiah and the Psalms and all the rest of it. So I think that she would have had some infused knowledge concerning, Jesus and what that would mean. Yeah, I think that that's inescapable. And then, of course, very soon they go to the temple with the baby Jesus, and she sees Simeon, and Simeon says that a sword will pierce your own soul too. So that's confirmed in her. But I do think that it wasn't like an angel popped out of nowhere and she was like, oh, wow, and she had absolutely no idea. I think that, she knew that she was involved in a narrative that had been going on for a very, very long time. She was very much, I imagine that she was aware that was unfolding to some degree. But of course, she had to walk in darkness and in faith.
I suppose Mary's concerns is one that visits all mothers, and so not knowing whether you are a mother, I have to ask, what makes mothers transcend the fear that when they give birth to their children, their children will inevitably suffer and encounter mishaps?
Yeah, I am a mother, and in fact, I think this is also why I'm very attached to Mary, is that you know, she's very important for mothers because she exemplifies, you know, what mothers fear and what mothers go through, and the courage that mothers have to have, because mothers and their children are so intertwined. You know, when the baby's born, you know, the baby doesn't know the difference between the baby's hand and the mother's hand, and the selves are very mixed up. So you know, we suffer tremendously when that separation happens, and then we suffer tremendously when they suffer. And so with Mary and Jesus, coming back to how Mary can increase our devotion to Christ, when Mary watches Christ on the cross and Christ die, that's suffering. She's compassionate. She suffers with him. In a sense, she goes through her own passion. And this is why it's so important that we follow her as well as Jesus, you know. And I think that we look to Mary as mothers, as somebody who exemplifies courage by placing their faith in Christ, and knowing that we have to let our children go and to fulfill their vocation in God, and God's will has to be done. So yeah, I think she's a tremendously important figure, and it's about that acceptance, not just of God's blessings, but also the fact that through God's blessings we sometimes have to suffer enormously.
So do you believe that poetry is a way to get closer to God?
Actually, I do. Funnily enough, I do, because I always say that, you know, poetry is the sister of prayer. And when I used to write poetry, I was aware of the fact that my mind would go to a different place. And I was almost like I would have to kind of just, I used to say, kind of tilt my antennae, you know, like an old television set, like kind of just listen for something. And when I converted, I was aware of the fact that that state of mind was very similar to the state of mind we have during prayer. It's that same way of kind of being open to something. Because I think when you're really writing poetry, and it's a true poem, you are literally receiving, you know, something from the Holy Spirit. There is something divine about it. So I think that the poems that are in 100 Great Catholic Poems, which are all very Catholic,
Mhm.
it's really also, it's a book of poems, but it's also a book that you can use in your prayer life. You know, if you've prayed and you've contemplated and you just want to immerse yourself some more in some contemplation, then use the poems, because they're through 2000 years, and they're written by, you know, some of the doctors and saints of the church as well as many other people, and they're all very faithful, and they're all very attuned to that divine input.
Mhm. So tell me more about the state of contemporary, at least English language poetry today.
Well, I hesitate to say anything because I'm kind of out of it. I'm not as involved as I was, because I live in Italy now, so I don't know too much about it. And I know more about American poetry in a sense. I think American poetry does kind of push itself towards the spiritual. Like there's a famous American poet called Mary Oliver who has since died, but she was always trying to kind of, you know, refer to spiritual things and kind of looking beyond the everyday. I think the Americans do that much better than the British. But I don't want to say too much because I kind of am out of touch with British poetry. At the same time, I can see from my contemporaries, some friends of mine, it's not always very difficult to get noticed if you're writing religious poetry. That's
Mhm.
kind of not considered very fashionable. Um, on the other hand, there's a Catholic convert called Maria Apicella, who's English with an Italian name, and she wrote a book of poems called Psalmody, and it was incredibly successful, and it won a major prize. So, you know, there are grounds for optimism, but I think that if I can, this is kind of pure opinion, but one theory I have is that the British sensibility was profoundly harmed by the Reformation, and that when Mary was suppressed and various rituals and rites were suppressed, we suppressed a lot of our emotion and a lot of ourselves. And I think that even in literature, it seems to me that literature can become a bit dry and a bit repressed occasionally, not always.
But still, there were a substantial amount of great post-Reformation British English language poetry. You got your Shakespeare and Tennyson?
Oh, sure, but I mean, I put Shakespeare into 100 great Catholic poems. I think Shakespeare was Catholic. I do, and of course Milton. Milton's wonderful, but you can see already if you compare Milton to somebody like Dante, you can really see how the faith changes in those between those two kind of perspectives on the Christian faith. Um, yeah, absolutely. There are brilliant poets, but I just have this feeling that it kind of changed things a little bit, even like into the 20th century. Even though you've got amazing, oh, I mean, you've got poets like T.S. Eliot who are absolutely fantastic, and Auden, etc., etc. But I wonder whether we kind of have almost forgotten how to write about the transcendent a little bit. But I would like to be proved wrong. So if anybody wants to send me some names of people writing now, I'd love to hear about them. I can mention Maria Apicella, who's fantastic, and also Catherine Simmons and Sarah Law. Those are all poets who are religious, and they bring religion into their poetry, and they write really, really good poetry. But I'd like them to be more noticed. I'd like them to be more successful. Perhaps this is what I'm trying to say. It's not that it's not being written, it's that it's not being appreciated as much as it could be.
Mhm. Tell me more about the difference between Milton and Dante when it comes to Christian faith.
Oh, I was worried you'd say that to me because I'm not really a Milton expert, but I happened to be looking at it recently, and I know much more about the Divine Comedy. Um, so in the Divine Comedy, which is 14th century Italian, it's all about man's pilgrimage. So at the very beginning, he's caught in this dark wood, which is basically where he's lost his way, and he he's spiritually disconnected. And then he begins his journey through hell and purgatory and into heaven, and then has the beatific vision where he sees the face of God. Now, what drives that whole journey is the desire to see God, but his guide is is Beatrice, who he fell in love with on earth. And Beatrice, it's quite clear, is a kind of type of Mary. So it's a very, very Mariological thing. And it's almost like it is like a love letter. It's a poem that's powered by love. It's very it's kind of scary, you know, and it's very sensual. And at the same time, it's about falling in love and being powered on and being led by Mary up to Jesus. Whereas, you know, with Milton, it strikes me as of course, there's, you know, it's not so Marian, obviously, and it's about being, you know, kicked out of Eden, and it's got a very different vibe to it. Is all I'll say because I haven't studied Milton as much as the Divine Comedy.
Okay. I guess from my reading of Paradise Lost, I understand that it is an intensely Christian piece of work,
Yeah.
but it also can have an appeal amongst non-Christians. It's the same sort of appeal as The Lord of the Rings.
Mm, yeah.
Intensely Christian, but non-Christians can find substantial value in it.
I think that's true. And the same thing for the Divine Comedy. I think that these works of literature, when they're truly great, then they transcend even what they're talking about. I mean, people can relate to them because they sense the truth in them. So I think that's really important.
Mhm. So, how did you come to the conclusion that Shakespeare was Catholic?
Well, I'm very clear in the introduction that I'm not a scholar in that sense. So I haven't done the historical research, and I point to some books that have been written saying that he is Catholic, and we know that there are books that have been written saying he's not Catholic. He's all kinds of things. He's a woman. He's many people. You know, all these different things. But I really focused on the actual texts themselves, and as I was putting together the poems, I was focusing on, you know, how do we define Catholic poetry? What does that really mean? And I talk about kind of identifying a beating Catholic heart. And the beating Catholic heart is about the experience of life as sacramental. So that's the idea that God is coming into our life in a physical way. Okay, that's the first thing. And about sensuality, because it's a very sensual religion. You know, we literally take God in our mouths. So it's very sensual and very physical. And it's a way of looking at the world that really takes in the vast sweep of scriptural tradition and Catholic poetic tradition as well. And so when it came to Shakespeare, I was aware of all of those things, especially with regard to Hamlet. I use a sonnet from the sonnet sequence from Romeo and Juliet when Romeo kisses Juliet. And I also use sonnet 116, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. And I also use a speech from Hamlet, which is I have of late, about when he's, I should quote from it, but I can't put my glasses on.
Is it like what
But
a
it's
piece of
about,
work is man? Something
that's it.
like that.
That's the one. And I I reference in the introduction, I reference Ted Hughes's book, which is a kind of a genius, crazy book called Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being. And even though Ted Hughes wasn't Catholic, he argued that Shakespeare was Catholic and was presenting a Catholic perspective, because Catholicism and what I was talking about earlier, the kind of the Marian side of things, had been suppressed. And Ted Hughes felt that that had created a kind of madness in the British psyche, which I would agree with. So I think that Shakespeare's work sort of demonstrates this in a very raw way. So Hamlet's, what a piece of work is man, is an absolute, it's a perfect kind of exemplar of that. I'm so terrible at remembering lines.
First, you're welcome to recite it if you have it in front of you.
Shall I?
Yes,
Okay.
please do.
Okay. So this is from Hamlet. I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, foregone all custom of exercises. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition, that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire. Why, it appeareth nothing to me, but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, nor woman neither, though by your smiling you seem to say so. So that's really, to me, the Catholic vision right there. He's talking about what an incredible world this is. A man's place within it is very much on Aquinas's ladder of being between the angels and the animals, and how we can work for divinization. We are like gods and we're supposed to become like God. But that has been taken away from Hamlet by this awful murder, and the fact that his father was killed without access to the sacraments, which is told very clearly within the play. So yeah, so that was why Shakespeare.
That was a wonderful recital. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, which brings me to the question that I've encountered during my studies in Shakespeare. You often see these like websites where you explain Shakespeare in contemporary English, and I find that to be devaluing his wonderful prose. So, what do you think?
So you're talking about those kind of websites where they paraphrase Shakespeare all the way through and make it into modern English.
Yeah, like No Fear Shakespeare or SparkNotes.
I suppose, I don't know. I guess it has its place for kids who really have trouble with the verse. But I think it's important that we don't forget the verse, and we have to go back to that all the time. Yeah, I think that there's a risk that we overlook the real verse. But I think what's more worrying is when we look at speeches and scenes without looking at the whole play. Because in England, I think there's a tendency these days to not look at the whole play, but just to look at bits of the play. And I think that that's a shame. That's a big shame. Because I think we're dumbing it down, and people need to be able to, look at a whole play, I would say.
Yes, I have the same feeling. So speaking of, what are some of Shakespeare's most significant Christian plays?
Oh gosh, you're giving me some tough questions, aren't you, today? Well, gosh, yeah. I mean, King Lear would be pre-Christian, wouldn't it? I guess. What would you say? Which is, I don't know. Which is his? What would you say? I suppose Measure for Measure has got lots of Christian. Yeah, but I would say all of his plays really have Christian themes running through it, because it was such a deeply, deeply Christian society. I think themes of morality come up a lot, and themes of faith. And Hamlet, again, I think that it's very, very present. And and even in the King plays, like the Richard II and Richard III and the Henry plays, etc. there's so much about the divine right of kings that you can't really escape it. He was writing in a very, very Christian world, and it's throughout all of his work, really.
Yeah, I find that Measure for Measure and Merchant of Venice would be his most explicitly Christian play. The
Mhm.
second one would be a lot more problematic because it involves an interplay between Christianity and Judaism,
Yeah,
character
yeah.
of Shylock. But I find it very striking too in the plays Macbeth and Hamlet, the presence of ghosts, in that
Mm.
it signifies that there's an afterlife, which is not a feature in the pre-Christian world.
No, well, the ghost in Hamlet's specifically from purgatory.
Yeah.
So I guess that would say purgatory. The Macbeth, it's very pagan, isn't it? There's something very
Mhm.
pagan about it, and of course King Lear is very pagan as well. Um, but I guess even when he situates his work in a kind of pagan environment, he's showing the chaos that there is without the Christian religion. It's like the witches and the kind of in Lear, it's the unleashing of these terrible events. It seems to be very animal, very raw and savage.
Um, Tell me about whether you've included contemporary poetry in the collection.
Yeah, well, we decided not to put in any living poets because we thought that there should be a cutoff, and perhaps, with living poets, people have to stand the test of time before they were in a book that hopefully is going to be around and endure for many decades to come. So the cutoff is the end of the 20th century. And our last poet is George Mackay Brown, who I think died in 2005, if I remember rightly. Um, so we have some wonderful contemporary poets like Denise Levertov, who was an atheist convert to the Catholic faith from a Jewish family. We have Anne Porter, who's an American poet who was wonderful. Thomas Merton, um, David Jones, the Welsh sculptor, an artist and poet, um, G.K. Chesterton, Edith Sitwell, Carol Houselander. Um, yeah, I mean, the 20th century is very, very well represented. So this isn't just about antiquity. It's not just about the older poets. It's all the way through.
So, what of the 20th century do you believe that gave birth to so much great English poetry?
Um, I think every century has its great poetry. To be honest, I do. I I think that the Catholic poets of the 20th century were, well, it's hard to generalize, isn't it? It is. I didn't have trouble finding any great Catholic poets of the 20th century. Let's put it that way. It
Mhm.
seemed to me that there was plenty to choose from, and what that says, I'm not sure. Because there are great non-religious poets in the 20th century as well. I mean, I'm a sucker for modernism. I'm a sucker for free verse, and um, David Jones is a genius. So then there are so many others that there was no tension, even though I think that there's a big trend in Catholic literature towards formalism. I actually found there was plenty of stuff that wasn't formal as well. So there's a real mixture.
Perhaps what I find to be the greatest, certainly the most interesting poet of the 20th century is Eliot,
Mm,
in that he embraces modernism, but he has a lot to say against modernity. And I
yeah.
wonder if his Catholic faith plays into that
Mm, mm.
paradox.
Well, Eliot wasn't Catholic, so that's
Oh,
the
oh,
first. Yeah, that's an important thing to remember. He remained Anglican, which I
oh,
think
okay.
is, yeah, which I think was just a lot to do with his love of England, and I think it was a mistake. But you're right. He was certainly one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, and exactly right that in the truest sense, modernism is critical of modernity because modernism harkens back to the classical, you know, and it's critiquing the fragmentation and the chaos, and that's what Eliot was doing, and that's what Virginia Woolf was doing, and James Joyce, to an extent. So it's I love modernism. I think it's an incredibly important literary movement.
Yes, yes, I'm the same. They certainly put their finger on the pulse of what's going on in our
Yeah,
society, and that's why their work still resonate.
Mm.
So, final question, Sally Reed. What does poetry mean to you?
Um, to me, poetry is God's way of communicating with us. One of the ways he communicates with us. So it's quite a big claim. I think that, there's something divine about poetry, and that's why so much of scripture is poetry. That God is ineffable. We can't understand God in this life, and therefore we need metaphor, we need analogy, and that's why poetry is so incredibly important. So that's what it really means to me. It's about trying to look with the eyes of God and to think with the mind of God. So it's a big job.
On that wonderful note, thank you very much, Sally Reed, for joining this program.
Thank you.